The wind hit the platform first. It came off the planes like something alive, dragging dust and dead leaves across the wooden boards, rattling the tin sign that read Meridian Station, population 214. A woman stood alone beneath it. One gloved hand pressed her hat, the other gripping a suitcase that held everything she owned in the world. Her name was Clara Whitfield. She was 26 years old, and she had just stepped off a train into a town that did not know her name. Behind her, the train exhaled steam and pulled away, wheels grinding, whistle fading into the flat gray sky. She watched it go until it was nothing but a black smudge on the horizon. Then she was alone, completely alone. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded letter, the paper soft from being read too many times. She did not need to read it again. She already knew every word. Come to Meridian. There's work here. There's a home here. Do not stay in that house one more winter. The letter was from her aunt. The aunt who had died 3 weeks before Clara's train ever left the station. Clara stood there a long moment, the wind pulling at her skirt, and let herself feel the full weight of it. No aunt, no home waiting, no plan, just a woman standing in the cold with a suitcase and a letter from a dead woman. That was when she heard the horse. He came around the corner of the feed store at a slow walk, a tall man on a tall gray horse, his hat pulled low against the wind. He looked like he belonged to the land the way a fence post belongs to a field, like he had grown up out of it and would never fully leave it. His name was Jed Calloway. He was 31 years old, and he had not smiled in 140 days. He noticed the woman on the platform because everyone in Meridian noticed strangers. Word moved fast in a town this small, but he did not stop his horse. He had a list in his coat pocket: flour, nails, rope, a bottle of liniment for the mare's leg, and he did not have time for a stranger's troubles. He almost rode past her. Almost. But then he saw her hands. They were shaking, not from cold, but from something deeper. He had seen that shake before. In his own hands, the night his wife died. He pulled the gray horse to a stop. "Ma'am." His voice was low, rough at the edges, like a man who did not use it often. "You lost." Clara looked up. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The wind kept moving between them, the only thing that seemed to know what to do. "I was supposed to meet my aunt," she said finally. "Ruth Whitfield." Something shifted behind his eyes. A small flinch, quickly hidden. "Ruth passed," he said, "near a month back. Fever took her quick." Clara's suitcase slipped from her fingers and hit the platform with a hollow thud. She did not bend to pick it up. She simply stood there, staring at a man she had never met, absorbing the second loss of her life inside of 5 minutes. "I'm sorry," Jed said, and he meant it. He knew exactly what that kind of sorry sounded like from the inside. The town of Meridian sat low against the Wyoming plains, a scatter of wooden buildings holding on against a sky that seemed too big for them. It was the autumn of 1887, and the whole territory was bracing for something. Old-timers at the feed store had been saying it for weeks. The geese were flying low, the woodpiles were going up early, the sky had that flat white look that meant a hard winter was coming, maybe the hardest in years. Clara did not know any of this yet. She only knew that the wind here was colder than the wind back east, and that the man on the gray horse was still watching her with an expression she could not read. Not quite pity, not quite curiosity, something in between. "You got somewhere to stay?" he asked. "No." "Family here, besides your aunt?" "No." He was quiet for a moment, jaw working like he was chewing on a decision. "There's a boarding house," he said. "Mrs. Doyle runs it. Not fancy, but it's warm, and she won't ask questions you don't want to answer." "Thank you," Clara said, though her voice cracked slightly on the second word. He nodded once, the way men in this country nodded when words felt like too much. He turned his horse to go. Then he stopped again, looking back at her over his shoulder at the small, trembling woman standing next to a suitcase in a town where she knew no one. "Name's Jed Calloway," he said. "Ranch 2 miles north. You need anything, folks around here know where to find me." Then he rode off, and Clara Whitfield was alone again, but somehow, in a way she could not explain, a little less alone than before. That night, in a narrow room at Mrs. Doyle's boarding house, Clara sat by a small window and watched the last light drain out of the sky. She had $11 left. $11, a suitcase, and a dead aunt's promise that had turned to dust the moment she stepped off the train. She thought about the house she had left behind. She thought about her stepfather's voice, the way it filled every room he walked into, the way she used to make herself small so it would not find her. She thought about the years she had spent counting days until she was old enough, brave enough, desperate enough to leave. She had told herself Meridian would be different. A fresh start. A home. Family. Now there was no family. Only a stranger on a gray horse and a name she did not know how to hold on to, Jed Calloway. She did not know yet that 3 miles north of where she sat, that same man was standing in a dark kitchen, staring at a cold stove, thinking about a decision that would change both of their lives. Jed Calloway's ranch was quiet in the way that only grief can make a house quiet. His wife, Mary, had died in the spring, 3 days after their daughter was born too early and too small to survive the first winter without her. Jed had buried them both beneath the same cottonwood tree behind the barn, and since then, the house had become something he moved through rather than lived in. But he was not alone. Not entirely. In the small bedroom at the end of the hall slept his niece, Sadie, 6 years old, with her mother's chestnut hair and a habit of counting the stars through her window until she fell asleep. Sadie's own parents, Jed's brother and his wife, had died in a wagon accident 2 winters back, and Jed had taken her in without a second thought, the way you take in family, because there was simply no other option that made sense to his heart. He was raising a 6-year-old girl alone, on a ranch that needed 2 hands to run properly, heading into what every rancher in the county agreed would be the hardest winter in a decade. He stood at the window that night, looking north toward the mountains, where the clouds were already gathering low and heavy, the color of old bruises. He thought about the banknote due in March. He thought about the leaking roof over the tack room. He thought about Sadie's cough that had lingered 2 weeks now, and the long, lonely nights ahead when there would be no one to warm the second half of the bed, no one to help carry a frightened child back to sleep after a nightmare, no one but him. And then, unbidden, he thought about the woman on the platform, the shake in her hands, the way she had absorbed the news of her aunt's death without flinching outward, even as something inside her clearly broke. A woman with nowhere to go, a man with too much to carry alone. He shook his head at himself in the dark kitchen. It was a foolish thought, the kind of thought a lonely man has at the end of a long day, easily discarded by morning. He did not know, yet, that morning would only make the thought stronger. 3 days passed. Clara found no work in Meridian. The general store did not need help. The seamstress already had 2 girls. The schoolhouse had a teacher until spring at least. Her $11 had become 6, and Mrs. Doyle, though kind, could not offer charity forever. On the 4th morning, Clara walked to the edge of town, past the last building, out where the road turned to open plains, and she let herself cry for the first time since the train. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears freezing slightly on her cheeks in the cold morning air, the tears of a woman who had run out of places to run to. That was when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She turned, wiping her face quickly, and there he was again. Jed Calloway, sitting tall on the gray horse. Sadie perched in front of him wrapped in a wool blanket, her small face peeking out with wide, curious eyes. Jed took one look at Clara's red-rimmed eyes and said nothing about it. That, more than anything, was what made her trust him a little. "You found work yet?" he asked. "No. Found somewhere to stay past the month." Clara's silence answered for her. Jed looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at Sadie, who was studying Clara with the frank, unguarded curiosity that only children have. "Is she going to be sad forever, Uncle Jed?" Sadie asked, not bothering to whisper. "Sadie," Jed said, a warning in his voice, though it was gentle. "It's all right," Clara said, managing a small, surprised laugh, the first laugh she had allowed herself in weeks. "I'm not sad forever. Just today." Sadie seemed to accept this with the simple logic of a 6-year-old and went back to studying the horse's mane. Jed cleared his throat. His jaw tightened, the way it did when he was about to say something that cost him effort. "I've got a proposal," he said. "Might sound strange. I'd ask you to hear me out before you answer." Clara's heart, already raw and unguarded, went very still. "I've got a ranch," Jed continued. "Got a little girl who needs looking after in a house that's falling apart around the both of us. Winter's coming hard this year. Everybody says so, and everybody's usually right about that. I need help. Not the kind you hire and send home at supper. The kind that stays." Clara opened her mouth, but no words came. "I'm not asking for anything you'd have to explain to anybody as more than what it is," Jed said, his eyes steady on hers now, unflinching despite the clear discomfort in his voice. "Marry me for one winter. Come spring when the road's clear and the debt's settled. If you want to go, I'll drive you to the train station myself and never say another word about it." The wind moved between them again, the same wind from the platform, as if it had been waiting the whole time to hear what he would say. "You don't know me," Clara whispered. "No," Jed agreed. "But I know what it looks like when somebody's got nowhere left to turn. And I know what it's like to be too proud to ask for help until help isn't there anymore." Sadie tugged his sleeve. "Uncle Jed, is she going to live with us?" Neither adult answered her. Clara looked north, toward the mountains where the clouds sat low and dark, toward a life she could not yet see, offered to her by a stranger with tired eyes and an honest voice. She thought of Mrs. Doyle's rent due in 4 days. She thought of $6 in a coin purse. She thought of a letter from a dead woman that had brought her to a town that had nothing left for her. Nothing, except possibly this. "One winter," Clara repeated softly, testing the words in her mouth like they belonged to someone else's life. "One winter," Jed said. "That's all I'm asking." Clara looked up at him, at this quiet, grieving man on a gray horse, at the little girl wrapped in wool watching her with open, hopeful eyes, at the storm gathering slowly over the mountains behind them both. And she said the one word that would change everything. "All right." Jed's shoulders dropped slightly, some invisible weight easing, just barely. He reached down one hand toward her. "Then climb up," he said. "Storm's coming, and we've got a wedding to arrange before it does." Clara stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Behind her lay a town with nothing left to offer. Ahead of her lay a ranch, a child, a marriage built on nothing but necessity, and a man whose eyes held a grief so deep it nearly matched her own. She did not know yet that this stranger's hand would become the only safe place she had ever known. She did not know yet what winter would take from them, and what it would give back. She only knew that behind them, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, and somewhere far off, low against the horizon, the first sound of distant thunder rolled across the plains, like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what these two broken people would become to each other. Clara took his hand, and neither of them let go. The preacher's house smelled like wood smoke and boiled coffee. Reverend Hollis was an old man with a limp and kind eyes, the kind of man who had married half the county and buried the other half, and he did not ask Clara or Jed many questions. He had learned, over 30 years on the plains, that winter marriages of convenience were not uncommon, and that a person's reasons were their own business. "You understand what you're agreeing to?" he asked Clara quietly, while Jed was outside hitching the wagon, Sadie trailing behind him like a small shadow. "I understand," Clara said. "It's a real marriage," the Reverend said. "In the eyes of God and the county clerk, whatever the reasons behind it. You understand that too." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "All right, then," the Reverend said, and something in his voice was almost gentle. "Let's get you two out of this cold before it gets worse." The ceremony took 4 minutes. There was no dress, no flowers, no gathered friends throwing rice. There was only Clara in her traveling clothes, Jed in a clean shirt that still held the crease of having been folded in a drawer for a long time, and Sadie standing between them, holding a small bouquet of dried wildflowers she had picked herself from a jar on the Reverend's windowsill. When the Reverend said the words, "You may consider yourselves husband and wife," Jed did not kiss her. He simply looked at her, a long, steady look, and said, quiet enough that only she could hear it, "Thank you." Clara did not know what to say back, so she said nothing. But something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since the moment she stepped off that train, loosened just slightly. The ranch sat at the base of a low ridge, a modest house with a sagging porch, a barn that had seen better winters, and a scattering of outbuildings that all needed work Jed had not had time for. Smoke rose from the chimney where Jed had banked the fire that morning before riding into town, not knowing he would return with a wife. Clara stood in the yard as the wagon rolled to a stop, taking it all in. The tilted fence posts, the empty flower beds gone to weeds, the curtains in the front window that hung crooked on their rod. It was a house that had been cared for once, and then abandoned to grief. "It's not much," Jed said, watching her face carefully. "I know it needs work." "It needs a woman's hand," Clara said, and then immediately flushed, worried the words had come out wrong. But Jed only nodded, something like relief passing over his features. "That's honest," he said. "I'll give you that." Sadie tugged Clara's sleeve. "Do you want to see my room? I have a shell from the ocean. Uncle Jed says I've never seen the ocean, but I still have a shell." Clara looked down at the little girl's upturned face, so eager, so unguarded, so hungry for someone new to notice her, and something in Clara's chest cracked open in a different way than grief had cracked it. "I would love to see your shell," Clara said. Sadie beamed and grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the house, and Jed stood in the yard a moment longer, watching the two of them go, something unreadable moving behind his tired eyes. The first week was an education in silence. Jed was not unkind, but he was not a man of easy conversation. He rose before dawn to tend the animals, worked until dusk on the endless list of repairs the ranch demanded, and ate his supper with the quiet efficiency of a man who had eaten alone for too long to remember how to make a meal into a conversation. Clara filled the silence the only way she knew how, with work. She scrubbed the kitchen floor until it shone. She patched the crooked curtains. She found Mary's old sewing basket in a trunk in the hall closet and, after a long hesitation, used it to mend Sadie's torn coat, her fingers moving carefully over fabric that had once belonged to a woman she would never meet, a woman whose ghost seemed to live in every corner of this house. She found herself, more than once, standing in front of the small portrait on the mantel, a young woman with dark hair and a soft smile, painted the year she and Jed had married. Clara did not know what to feel looking at it. Not jealousy exactly, something closer to reverence, mixed with a strange, hollow loneliness, as if she were living inside a story that had already ended before she arrived. One evening, she caught Jed watching her from the kitchen doorway as she straightened the portrait's frame. "That's Mary," he said quietly. "I gathered." "You don't have to move it," he said, "if it bothers you." "It doesn't bother me," Clara said, and meant it. "I think Sadie should grow up seeing her mother's face." Something shifted in Jed's expression, surprise, maybe, or gratitude too large for words. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, then closed it again and retreated back to the barn, the way he always did when feelings threatened to rise too close to the surface. Clara watched him go, her hands still resting on the portrait frame, and wondered what it might take to see that man's guard come down even an inch. The storm the old-timers had warned about arrived on the 9th night. It came without much warning, a sudden drop in temperature, the wind screaming around the corners of the house like something wounded, snow driving sideways so thick that by midnight, the barn was invisible from the kitchen window, though it stood only 40 feet away. Clara woke to the sound of Sadie crying. She found the little girl sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face, her small body shaking, not from cold but from something worse. "Sadie, sweetheart, what's wrong?" "I can't breathe right," Sadie gasped between sobs, and Clara's blood went cold at the sound. A thin, whistling wheeze underneath every breath, a sound Clara recognized from a childhood neighbor's croup, a sound that meant danger. "Jed!" Clara's voice cracked through the house like a shot. "Jed, come quick!" He was there in seconds, pulling on his shirt, his face draining of color the moment he heard Sadie's breathing. "How long's she been like this?" "I don't know, I just woke up." Jed was already lifting Sadie into his arms, murmuring low, steady words to her that Clara couldn't quite hear. The practice calm a man who had learned, through terrible loss, how to keep his voice even when everything inside him was screaming. "Boil water," he said to Clara. "Get it steaming. We need to get her breathing the vapor. There's a kettle under the sink." Clara ran. Her hand shook as she worked the stove, coaxing the banked coals back to flame, filling the kettle, every second stretching thin and sharp with fear. Behind her, she could hear Jed's voice in the bedroom, low and constant, and Sadie's frightened, wheezing cries slowly softening under the sound of it. When the kettle finally began to steam, Clara carried it to the bedroom, where Jed sat on the edge of the bed with Sadie curled against his chest, his large hand rubbing slow circles on her back. "Tent," he said. "We need to tin a blanket over her and the kettle. Let her breathe the steam." Clara understood at once. She draped a quilt over the two of them, creating a small enclosed space around the rising steam, and then knelt on the floor beside the bed, holding the kettle steady, watching Sadie's small chest rise and fall. For the next hour, the three of them stayed like that. Jed holding Sadie, Clara holding the kettle, the storm screaming outside the window, the whole world narrowed down to one small girl's breathing and the desperate hope that it would ease. Slowly it did. The wheeze softened. The frantic gasping settled into something closer to normal, exhausted breathing. Sadie's small fists, which had been clenched tight in her uncle's shirt, finally relaxed. "There you go," Jed whispered, his voice raw. "There you go, baby girl. Breathe easy now." It was well past 3 in the morning when Sadie finally fell into real sleep, her breathing steady, her face peaceful for the first time in hours. Jed laid her down gently and tucked the quilt around her small shoulders, his hand lingering on her hair a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked up at Clara, still kneeling on the floor beside the empty kettle, her nightdress damp with steam, her hair falling loose from its braid, and something passed between them that neither one had words for yet. "Thank you," he said. His voice broke slightly on the second word. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't heard her." "You would have heard her," Clara said softly. "You're her family. So are you now," Jed said, whether either of us planned on it or not. The words hung in the quiet room, heavier than either of them expected. Clara did not go back to her own bed that night. She sat in the chair beside Sadie's bed until dawn, watching the little girl breathe, unwilling to leave until she was certain the danger had truly passed. She did not notice, until the gray light of morning crept through the curtains, that Jed had never left either, that he sat on the floor against the wall across the room, his long legs stretched out, his hat his lap, watching over both of them in silence. When Clara finally met his eyes in the pale morning light, neither of them looked away. "You didn't have to stay," he said quietly. "Neither did you," she answered. He almost smiled then, the first almost smile she had seen from him since the platform. It did not fully arrive, but it came close enough that Clara felt something warm unfurl in her chest, dangerous and unfamiliar. One winter, she reminded herself, this is only supposed to last one winter. But some quiet, honest part of her was already beginning to wonder what would happen when spring came and the roads cleared and Jed drove her, as promised, to the train station. She was beginning to wonder if she would want to get on that train at all. The days that followed the storm brought a new kind of quiet to the house. Not the strained, careful silence of strangers learning to share a roof, but something gentler. Sadie recovered fully within a week, though she now insisted on sleeping with her door cracked open. "So I can hear if you're still there," she told Clara one night, small fingers gripping Clara's sleeve. "I'll always be close enough to hear you," Clara promised, and meant it more than she expected to. Jed began talking more. Small things at first. The names of the cattle, an old story about Mary teaching him to dance in this very kitchen. The year the well had run dry and the whole county had to haul water from the river for a month. Clara listened to every word like it was precious, filing away pieces of this man's life the way she once collected pressed flowers as a girl, careful, quiet treasures. One evening in late November, as they sat together mending a torn harness by lamplight, Jed's shoulder brushed against hers, and neither of them pulled away. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why'd you really leave back east? A woman like you, smart, capable. Most folks don't leave everything behind for a letter from an aunt they barely knew. Clara's hands stilled on the harness. The old fear rose in her, the instinct to deflect, to smile, and change the subject the way she had for years. But something about the quiet kitchen, the lamplight, the steady patience in Jed's eyes, made the old defense feel suddenly unnecessary. "My stepfather," she said slowly, "was not a kind man. Not in ways I could prove to anyone, not in ways that left marks you could see. But I spent 10 years making myself smaller so he wouldn't notice me. When my aunt's letter came, it wasn't really about the job or the town. It was about getting far enough away that I could finally breathe." Jed set down the harness. His jaw tightened, that same warning sign she'd learned to recognize, though this time she understood it was not directed at her. "He ever lay a hand on you?" "No," Clara said. "He didn't need to. There are other ways to make a person feel like nothing." Jed was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than before. "You're not nothing here," he said. "I hope you know that." Clara looked up at him, and for the first time since the platform, since the wedding, since every careful wall she had built around her heart over 10 long years, she let herself really look at him, at the tired lines around his eyes, the strength in his hands, the grief he carried so quietly it was easy to miss the tenderness underneath it. "Jed," she whispered. "Yeah." But before she could find the words for whatever was rising in her chest, a sharp knock rattled the front door. 3 hard raps, urgent, out of place in the quiet night. Jed frowned, rising from his chair. Bit late for visitors. He crossed to the door and pulled it open, and the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it a man Clara did not recognize, tall, weathered, with the hard eyes of someone who had ridden a long way in bad weather to deliver news that would not wait for morning. "Jed Calloway?" the man asked. "That's me." The stranger's eyes flicked past Jed, landing on Clara for just a moment, something calculating in his gaze before he looked back at Jed. "Name's Silas Rourke," he said. "I work for the Meridian Bank. And I worked for your late wife's family, too, when they asked it of me." Jed went very still. "What business do you have riding out here at this hour?" Silas reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, holding it out with the flat, practiced calm of a man delivering bad news for a living. "Your note's coming due early," he said. "March 1st, not April, like you were told before. And there's something else." His eyes flicked to Clara again, lingering this time. "Mary's family's filed a claim on this land. Says it was never rightfully yours to keep, not without a wife to hold it alongside you, and not while there's bloodkin who says you drove her to her grave." The kitchen went silent, except for the wind outside and the sound of the fire cracking in the hearth. Clara felt the warmth of the evening drain out of the room entirely, replaced by something cold and sharp and frightening. Jed's hand, still holding the door, had gone white-knuckled. "That's a lie," he said, low and dangerous. "And you know it." "Don't matter what I know," Silas said, unbothered. "Matters what a judge in Cheyenne decides come spring, when the road's clear enough for a hearing." His eyes moved once more to Clara, cool and assessing. "Course, might matter that you've gone and remarried so quick. Judge might wonder about a man who buries one wife and takes another before the snows even melted off her grave." He tipped his hat, folded the paper, and pressed it into Jed's unmoving hand. "You'll want a lawyer," Silas said. "If you can find one out here, who'll take your case." He turned to go, then paused on the porch steps, looking back one last time. "For what it's worth, Calloway, I always did like Mary. Hate to see what her family's about to do to what's left of her memory." Then he was gone, swallowed by the dark and the cold, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the wind. Jed stood in the open doorway for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly in his hand, the night air pouring in around him like it, too, wanted answers he didn't have. Clara rose slowly from her chair, her heart pounding. "Jed," she said carefully. "What did he mean? About Mary's family?" "About," she hesitated. "About you driving her to her grave?" Jed did not turn around. His shoulders had gone rigid, his whole body a wall. She had never seen him raise before, not even on the worst night of Sadie's fever. "Jed," she said again, softer this time. "Talk to me." When he finally turned to face her, the warmth that had been building between them all evening had vanished, replaced by something guarded and afraid, something that looked, for just a moment, like a man bracing for the one person in this house who might finally look at him the way the rest of the county already did. "There's things about Mary's death," he said slowly, "that I never told you, that I never told anyone, except the one person who already knows and hates me for it." Outside, the wind screamed against the windows and the fire in the hearth guttered low, and Clara stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the husband she had known for barely 2 weeks, realizing with a cold, sinking certainty that she did not know this man at all. Not really, not the parts of him that mattered most. "Tell me," she whispered, and Jed Calloway, for the first time since his wife died beneath the cottonwood tree behind the barn, opened his mouth to finally say the words he had buried alongside her. "Mary's heart was weak," Jed said, "had been since she was a girl. Doc Ferris told her when she first came to him carrying Sadie's cousin, the baby that came before, the one we lost early, that another pregnancy could kill her. Told her plain, no soft words about it." Clara stood very still, afraid to move, afraid that any sound might stop him from finally saying what he had carried alone for so long. "She wanted a child so bad," Jed went on, his voice hollowed out by memory. "Wanted it more than she was afraid of dying. And he stopped, swallowed hard. "I could have said no. Could have been the one to say we're not doing this. Mary, I won't lose you over it. But I didn't. I let her decide. Told myself it was her body, her choice, her right to want what she wanted. Jed, the night she went into labor, the storm was already coming down hard, same as tonight. Doc Ferris couldn't get out from town in time. I delivered our daughter myself on that bed down the hall, with nothing but a midwife's book and Mary telling me what to do between pains." His hands were shaking now, the folded bank paper still crushed in his fist. "Baby lived 3 days. Mary lived 3 more after that. Her heart just stopped giving out the strength it needed. And I stood there and watched both of them go, knowing the whole time I could have stopped it before it started." The kitchen was silent except for the wind. "Mary's family says I killed her," Jed said, the words finally breaking free like something long damned. "Said I should have forbid it. Should have taken her to a proper hospital in Cheyenne the moment she started showing. Should have done 100 things different." And the worst part, Clara, his eyes finally lifted to hers, raw and unguarded in a way she had never seen. "The worst part is some nights. I think they're right." Clara crossed the kitchen without deciding to move. She took his shaking hands in both of hers, the crumpled paper still caught between his fingers, and she held on. "You didn't kill her," Clara said, fierce and certain. "You loved a woman who wanted something enough to risk everything for it, and you honored her enough to let her choose. That's not murder, Jed. That's the hardest kind of love there is." "Tell that to a judge in Cheyenne," Jed said bitterly. "I will," Clara said. "If it comes to that, I'll tell anyone who asks." Jed looked down at her, at this woman he had married out of desperation 2 weeks ago, who was standing in his kitchen at midnight, holding his shaking hands like she had every right to, like his grief was something she intended to carry alongside him rather than run from. "Why?" he asked quiet. "Why would you fight for me? You don't owe me that. This was supposed to be one winter, a favor, nothing more." Clara was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice trembled with something that had been building inside her since the storm, since Sadie's small hand gripping her sleeve, since every quiet evening of harness mending and half-told stories. "Because it stopped being nothing more a while ago," she said. "At least for me." Jed's breath caught. His hand, still wrapped in hers, turned slowly until their fingers laced together properly for the first time. "Clara," he said, low and rough, "if you're saying what I think you're saying." "I'm saying I don't want to get on that train in spring," Clara said, and the words felt like setting down a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. I'm saying I want this to be real. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because I don't want to be anywhere else. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, the wind had begun to settle, the worst of the night's storm passing. Then Jed reached up, slow and careful, like she was something that might startle and run, and brushed a loose strand of hair back from her face. I wasn't looking for this, he said softly. Wasn't looking for anything, honest. Just needed help getting through winter. I know, Clara whispered. But I'm glad it was you standing on that platform, he said. I'm glad it was you who climbed up onto that wagon. He kissed her then. The first time, gentle and searching, 2 years of grief and 2 weeks of careful hope meeting in the quiet kitchen while the storm finally exhausted itself outside the window. Clara kissed him back with everything she had been too afraid to want since she was a girl learning to make herself small. When they finally broke apart, foreheads still touching, Jed let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 2 long years. We've got a judge to face in spring, he murmured. Then we'll face him together, Clara said. As a real family. Not bargain, not a favor. A family. Winter tightened its grip over the following weeks, but the house on the ridge no longer felt like a place holding its breath. Sadie noticed the change first, the way children always notice what adults try to hide. The easy touches between Clara and Jed, the soft laughter that had started appearing at supper, the way Jed had begun humming under his breath while he worked, an old tune Clara recognized after a while as a dance song. The same one he'd once mentioned teaching Mary in this very kitchen. Clara did not feel like she was replacing anyone. Mary's portrait still hung on the mantel, and some evenings Clara found herself talking to it quietly while she worked, thanking her, in her own private way, for a husband and a daughter who had somehow become the family Clara had spent her whole life waiting for. But the threat from Meridian Bank did not disappear simply because 2 hearts had found each other in a dark kitchen. Silas Rourke's warning hung over the ranch like the low gray clouds that never fully lifted that winter. Jed rode into town twice seeking a lawyer, and twice came back with nothing. Every attorney in the county either too expensive or too unwilling to take on Mary's family, whose name carried weight in Cheyenne that Jed's did not. We'll figure it, Jed told Clara each time, though the worry lines around his eyes deepened with every failed trip. Clara believed him, but she also began, quietly, to prepare for the possibility that believing might not be enough. The hearing was set for the first thaw, the second week of March, in the county courthouse in Cheyenne, a 2-day wagon ride through roads still half frozen and treacherous. Reverend Hollis offered to travel with them and testify to the marriage's legitimacy. Mrs. Doyle, who had grown fond of Clara during those first lonely days in Meridian, insisted on watching Sadie so the girl wouldn't have to sit through a courtroom built for arguments no child should hear. The morning they left, the whole town seemed to have gathered outside Mrs. Doyle's boarding house. Not a large crowd. This was Meridian after all, but enough. The blacksmith, the seamstress, the old-timers from the feed store, people Clara barely knew, who had somehow, in one hard winter, come to know her. Give him hell, Calloway, the blacksmith called out, and Jed managed something close to a real smile as he helped Clara up onto the wagon seat. The 2-day ride to Cheyenne was quiet, filled mostly with the creak of wagon wheels and the vast white silence of a landscape just beginning to remember what green looked like. On the second night, camped beneath a stand of cottonwoods not so different from the one behind Jed's barn, Clara found him sitting alone by the fire, staring into the flames. Scared? She asked, settling beside him. Terrified, Jed admitted. Not of losing the ranch. Scared of a judge looking at everything Mary's family says about me and believing it. Scared Sadie grows up hearing folks say her uncle's a man who let her mother die. Clara took his hand, the way she had that first night in the kitchen. Then we make sure he hears the truth instead. The courtroom in Cheyenne was small and cold, wooden benches creaking under the weight of a modest gathering. Mary's family seated stiff and unsmiling on one side, Clara and Jed and Reverend Hollis on the other. Silas Rourke stood near the back, arms crossed, watching with the detached interest of a man who was paid to be present rather than invested. Mary's father, a stern man named Elias Grant, spoke first, laying out the family's claim with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed his grief into something sharp enough to use as a weapon. He spoke of a daughter lost too young. He spoke of a husband who let her risk everything for a child. He spoke, finally, of a hasty remarriage that suggested, in his words, a man more interested in convenience than in mourning his wife properly. When it was Jed's turn, his voice shook at first, but steadied as he spoke, not defending himself, exactly, but simply telling the truth, plainly and without excuse. He spoke of Mary's fierce desire for a child. He spoke of the choice she made with her whole heart, and his choice to honor it, even knowing what it might cost. He did not ask for sympathy. He only asked to be believed. Then Reverend Hollis rose and spoke of a marriage entered honestly, of a household transformed in a single winter from a place of grief into a place of genuine love, the kind he said he had witnessed grow slowly, carefully, with his own eyes over the months since the wedding. And then Clara stood. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. When she told the judge about a storm-tossed night with a sick little girl, about a man who held his niece through her fear without once thinking of himself, about a husband who had told her the hardest truth of his life not to excuse himself, but because he could no longer bear to carry it alone. I did not marry Jed Calloway out of convenience, Clara said, looking not at the judge, but at Elias Grant, whose stern face had, almost imperceptibly, begun to soften. I married a man who loved his wife enough to let her live and die on her own terms, and who has spent every day since trying to be worthy of the daughter she left behind. If that's a crime, then I suppose I'm guilty of loving him for it. The courtroom was silent for a long moment. It was Elias Grant, finally, who broke it, rising slowly from his seat, his weathered face suddenly looking every one of his 60-some years. Mary wrote us letters, he said quietly, to the judge, though his eyes stayed on Jed. Before she passed, told us how much she loved this man, told us it was her choice, all of it, and that if anything happened, we weren't to blame him. His voice cracked. I burned those letters out of grief, out of anger I needed somewhere to put. I've regretted it every day since. He looked at Jed directly for the first time. I think some part of me needed you to be the villain, son, because the alternative was accepting that sometimes the people we love most make choices that break our hearts anyway, and there's no one left to blame for it. The judge, watching the exchange, made his ruling with little ceremony after that. The claim was dismissed. The ranch, the land, the life Jed and Clara had built together through one hard winter remained theirs. They rode home slower than they'd ridden out, no longer racing against a hearing date, simply enjoying the way the plains had begun, in their absence, to soften into spring. New grass pushed up green and stubborn through patches of retreating snow. The cottonwoods along the river had begun to bud. The whole world seemed to be exhaling after a long, held breath. Sadie ran out to meet them the moment the wagon crested the ridge, chestnut hair flying, Mrs. Doyle laughing behind her on the porch. Jed swung down and caught his niece up into his arms, spinning her once before setting her down, and Clara watched the two of them with a fullness in her chest she had never expected to feel again after all her years of making herself small. That evening, after Sadie had fallen asleep with her door cracked open the way she still liked it, Jed found Clara standing on the porch, looking north toward the mountains, where the last of the winter's snow still clung stubbornly to the highest peaks even as the valley below had begun to green. Judge asked me something after the ruling, Jed said, coming to stand beside her. Asked if I intended to renew my vows to you proper. Said a marriage built on necessity ought to be given the chance to become something chosen freely once the necessity's gone. Clara turned to look at him. What did you tell him? Jed reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it out to her. A simple ring, plain gold, clearly old, clearly precious. This was my mother's, he said. I want you to have it. Not because you're owed it. Not because winter's over and some bargain's been kept. Because I choose you, Clara Calloway. Not out of convenience. Not out of desperation. Because somewhere in this hard winter, you became the only person I want beside me for every winter after. Clara's eyes filled with tears, the good kind, the kind she had almost forgotten existed. I choose you too, she whispered. I chose you a long time ago. I just didn't have the courage to say it until you gave me a reason to believe it might be safe. He slid the ring on her finger, his hands no longer trembling, and pulled her close beneath the wide Wyoming sky. The mountains standing silent witness behind them. The first green shoots of spring pushing up all around the ranch that had once been a house of grief and was now, unmistakably, a home. Inside, through the lamplit window, Sadie's small shape stirred once in her sleep and settled again. Safe, warm, unaware of anything except the simple fact that she was loved. Outside, on the porch, two people who had once been strangers on a train platform stood wrapped in each other's arms as the last light of a long winter finally gave way to spring. No longer a bargain, no longer a favor, no longer one winter. Just the beginning of every winter after.